Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely to welcome a more than capacity crowd. They're still queuing round the block, apparently. Wonderful welcome to the fourth and last of this first series of Roger Scruton Memorial Lectures, which I think will prove a great innovation, and I believe there's every intention of repeating the idea. It's a wonderful way to remember Roger. I knew him for more than 40 years, and I have very good memories of him. I remember Roger playing the piano. I remember Roger dancing. I remember Roger thinking. I remember Roger drinking. And I remember riding with Roger. And as we rode along, he said, the thing about being with a horse, riding a horse, is that you're with a non-opinion-bearing animal. Well, the same could not be said of Roger. He had plenty of opinions, but the point was that he understood those opinions needed to arise from great knowledge and great thought, and that led to the originality of his opinions. And the same could very precisely be said of our guest tonight, Jonathan Sumption. Just before I ask him to speak, I'll just explain what's actually going to happen. He's going to speak from this podium and deliver his lecture, and then there'll be this quick change of scene, and he and I will sit down and talk in front of you, and then finally the Chancellor, who is with us, will wind up proceedings. Jonathan Sumption will be known to all of you, I'm sure. He is a great legal mind, and more than a legal mind, actually, because he sees it philosophically, he understands it politically, and he's also a great historian, particularly his 3-volume history of the 100 Years' War. And he was, until quite recently, a justice of the Supreme Court. So he's been at the very highest level of the legal profession and the highest level of mental capacity that highly brilliant profession can contain. And of course, since then, he's delivered the Wreath Lectures, which to some extent lifted the lid on some of the things he'd been dealing with all those years professionally. And now he's going to talk to us on the small subject of democracy. Please welcome Lord Sumption.
Roger Scruton was one of the most original minds of our time. He was commonly described as a conservative, but he wasn't a party man, and it would, I think, have been more accurate to call him a traditionalist. At any rate, he believed in the cumulative wisdom which humanity derives from its past. He was an intensely rational thinker who at the same time understood the limitations to what reason could achieve in the complicated world that human beings have spontaneously made for themselves. He was, of course, many other things: a fine musician, an elegant writer, a good friend and counselor, and a devoted husband and father. I wish that I could have submitted the text of this lecture to him in draft for his criticisms, but as it is, I deliver it in honor of his life now that it has ended. I'm grateful to the Scruton family, Sophie, Lucy, and Sam, for giving me the opportunity to pay homage in this way to my old friend. Towards the end of his long life, John Adams, one of the founding fathers of American democracy, became increasingly gloomy about its prospects. Writing to the Virginia politician John Taylor in 1814, he observed that democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy that did not commit suicide. When Adams chose the word suicide to describe the death of democracies, he was making a deliberate and important point. Democracies fail from within. They are not usually overwhelmed by external forces such as invasion or insurrection. They are not usually overthrown by internal coups. They fail because people spontaneously turn to more authoritarian forms of government. Adams had in mind the democracies of the ancient world, the only precedents available before the foundation of the United States. According to the orthodox narrative, the democracies of the ancient world had failed because people succumbed to the appeal of demagogues who promised them security at home and triumph abroad in return for submission to autocratic government. People simply lost interest in democracy. John Adams' somber prediction did not come true in his own day, but the question which I want to address with you this evening is whether it is becoming true in ours. The Pew Research Center has been tracking attitudes to democracy in different countries for some 30 years. Dissatisfaction with democracy has been rising in advanced democracies for most of that time. This is especially true of young people living in old democracies, the United States, the United Kingdom, France. In the most recent survey, the United Kingdom had one of the highest levels of dissatisfaction with democracy in the world at 69%. It seems that only Bulgaria and Greece think less of democracy than we do. Now, dissatisfaction with democracy does not, of course, necessarily imply a preference for some other system. But more disturbing findings emerge from the regular surveys of political engagement conducted in this country by the Hansard Society. In the 2019 survey, the latest available, 54% of respondents agreed with the statement, "Britain needs a strong leader willing to break the rules." Only 23% disagreed with that statement. Nearly half of those who wanted a strong leader willing to break the rules thought that he shouldn't have to worry too much about votes in Parliament. Now, polling evidence is not, of course, infallible, but these polls track attitudes over a substantial period of time, and at least they show the direction in which we are traveling. They are consistent with the historically high levels of electoral support for authoritarian figures such as Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, and the leading lights of Alternative for Deutschland. The first thing that I think we need to be clear about is what we mean by democracy. We are so familiar with its use as a general hurrah word that some definition at the outset seems desirable. What I mean by democracy is a constitutional mechanism for collective self-government. Democracy is a way of entrusting decision-making to people acceptable to a majority, whose power is defined and limited, and whose mandate is revocable. But the institutional framework is not enough. Plenty of countries have the institutional framework of a democracy, elections, and so on, without actually being one. And this is because democracy can only work in a legal and social culture where there is freedom of thought, speech and association, and uncontrolled access to reliable information, and a large tolerance of political dissent. A culture of this kind is difficult to create, and it is extremely fragile. Where democracies fail, it is not usually because the institutional framework has broken down, it is because the necessary cultural foundation has gone. The opposite of democracy is some form of authoritarian government. Of course, it's perfectly possible for democracies to confer very substantial coercive powers on the state without losing their democratic character. But there must be a point beyond which the systematic application of coercion is no longer consistent with any notion of collective self-government. The fact that that point is hard to define does not mean that it doesn't exist. A degree of respect for individual autonomy seems, to me at any rate, to be a necessary feature of anything that deserves to be called a democracy. The polling evidence which I have cited suggests that democracy is now increasingly vulnerable in the countries that gave birth to it. Why has this happened? The chief enemies of democracy are economic insecurity, intolerance, and fear. Historically, democracies have always been heavily dependent on economic optimism. Except for 2 short periods, the United States has enjoyed continuously rising levels of prosperity, both absolute and relative to other countries until quite recently. Britain's economic history, like that of other European countries, has been slightly more checkered, but the trajectory has generally been upwards. Today, the outlook is darker. We face problems of faltering growth, relative economic decline, redundant skills, and capricious patterns of inequality. In most democracies, including ours, GDP per head is still rising, albeit slowly. But people measure their well-being against their expectations. 60 years of post-war expansion have raised those expectations to a very high level. Economic misfortune usually bears hardest on the poorest members of society. It marginalizes them. It makes them feel that the current organization of their country has nothing to offer them. But in a more fundamental sense, the impact is likely to be felt at every level of society. The shattering of optimism is a dangerous moment in the life of any community. Disillusionment with the promise of progress was a major factor in the 30-year crisis of Europe, which began in 1914 and ended in 1945. That crisis was characterized by a resort to authoritarian government in most of Europe. Britain, the United States, and France escaped that fate. But in all 3 countries, there were powerful authoritarian movements of left and right, which drew their strength mainly from economic misfortune. Russia and Germany were widely regarded as the models which showed the way out, just as China sometimes is today. The second of democracy's great enemies is fear. People who are sufficiently frightened will submit to an authoritarian regime which offers them security against some real or imagined threat. Historically, the threat has usually been war. In the 2 world wars of the 20th century, Britain transformed itself into a temporary autocracy with substantial public support. Wars, however, are rare. This country has generally conducted its wars at a distance. It has not faced an existential threat from external enemies since 1940, unless you count the high point of the nuclear threat in the late 1960s. The real threat to democracy's survival is not major disasters like war. It is comparatively minor perils which occur much more frequently. Now, this may seem paradoxical, but reflect for a moment. The more routine the perils from which we demand protection, the more frequently will those demands arise. If we confer authoritarian powers on government to deal with perils which are an ordinary feature of human existence, we will end up doing it most or all of the time. It is because the perils against which we now demand protection from the state are so much more numerous than they were, that they are likely to lead to a more fundamental and more durable change in our attitudes to the state. This is, I think, a more serious problem for the future of democracy than war. It arises because of the growing aversion of Western societies to risk. We crave protection from many risks which are inherent in life itself: financial loss, economic insecurity, crime, sexual violence and abuse, sickness and accidental injury. Even the late pandemic, serious as it was, perhaps is, was well within the broad range of mortal diseases with which human beings have always had to live. It's certainly within the broad range of diseases with which we must expect to live in future. We call upon the state to save us from these things. Now, this is not irrational. It is in some ways a natural response to the remarkable increase in the technical competence of mankind since the middle of the 19th century, which has greatly increased the range of things that the state can do. As a result, we have inordinately high expectations of the state. We are less inclined to accept that there are things that it cannot or should not do to protect us. For all perils, there must be a governmental solution. If there isn't, that implies a lack of governmental competence. Attitudes to death are a revealing example. Few things are as routine as death. In the midst of life, we are in death, says the Book of Common Prayer. Yet, the technical possibilities of modern, publicly financed medicine have accustomed us to the idea that, except perhaps in extreme old age, any death from disease is premature, and all premature death is avoidable. So, starting as a natural event, death becomes a symptom of societal failure. In modern conditions, risk aversion and the fear that goes with it are a standing invitation to authoritarian government. If we hold governments responsible for everything that goes wrong, they will take away enough of our autonomy to ensure that nothing can go wrong. We have had a spectacular demonstration of this during the pandemic, where coercive measures with radical implications for our lives were made by ministers with strong public support but minimal parliamentary input. A minister told me some months ago that he thought that liberal democracy was a completely unsuitable instrument for dealing with a pandemic, and that something more Napoleonic, his word, was needed. Now, he was making a more significant point than I suspect he realized. Whatever one thinks about this, and my own views are well known, it unquestionably marks a significant change in our collective mentality. The quest for security at the price of state coercion is a feature of democratic politics which was pointed out in the 1830s by the great political scientist Alexis de Tocqueville in his remarkable study of American democracy, a book whose uncanny relevance still takes us by surprise even after 2 centuries. His description of the process cannot be bettered, so I will quote it. "The protecting power of the state," he wrote, "extends its arm over the whole community. It covers the surface of society with complicated rules, minute and uniform, through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate to rise above the crowd. The will of man is not shattered, but it is softened, bent, and guided. Men are seldom forced to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It doesn't tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes. It stupefies a people until each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd." Those words were written nearly 2 centuries ago. In many ways, the biggest threat to democracy is not, however, oppression by the state, but the intolerance of our fellow citizens. In the early years of British democracy, the great apostle of Victorian liberalism, John Stuart Mill, foresaw that the main threat to its survival would be the conformity imposed by public opinion. Roger Scruton once wrote that the freedom to entertain and express opinions, however offensive, is the precondition of a political society. Now, Roger had more personal experience of this than any of us. He was a persistent and joyful dissentient. In the same article, he identified the problem with unerring accuracy. To guarantee freedom of opinion, he wrote, goes against the grain of social life. It imposes risks that people may be reluctant to take. For in criticizing orthodoxy, you are not just questioning a belief, you are threatening the social order that has been built on it. The deliberate campaigns of suppression conducted by pressure groups against politically unfashionable or incorrect opinions on, for example, race, gender reassignment, or same-sex relationships. The attempt to impose a new vocabulary which implicitly accepts the campaigner's point of view. These things are symptoms of the narrowing of our intellectual world. The tests recently imposed on freshers at the University of St Andrews and the campaign against Kathleen Stock at the University of Sussex suggest that intellectual persecution is alive even in our universities, for the first time, perhaps, since Thomas Cranmer was burnt at the stake just 200 yards from here. Demonstrations, such as those currently organized by Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain, are based on the notion that the campaigner's point of view is the only legitimate one. It's therefore perfectly acceptable deliberately to bully people and disrupt their lives until they submit, instead of resorting to ordinary democratic procedures. This is the mentality of terrorists, but without the violence. Democracy can only survive if our differences are transcended by our common acceptance of the legitimacy of the decision-making process, even when we disagree profoundly with the outcome. This implicit bargain breaks down if a society repeatedly finds itself resorting to coercion to enforce the majority view about controversial moral and other issues. It breaks down if people feel more strongly about the issues than they do about democratic procedures for settling them. The result is the abandonment of political engagement and a growing resort to direct action of one kind or another. Direct action is an invitation to authoritarian government because it implicitly rejects diversity of opinion. It assesses the value of democratic institutions by one criterion only, namely the extent to which the activist's case has prevailed. Those who engage in direct action instinctively feel that the end is so important that it justifies the means, but they rarely confront the implications of their acts. What holds us together as a society is precisely the means by which we do things. Since we are never likely to agree on controversial issues of principle, what holds us together is not consensus, but a common respect for a method of solving our differences, whether or not we approve of the resulting decision. Conflicts of opinion and interest are natural features of every free society. The task of a political community is to accommodate them so that we can live together in peace without the systematic application of coercion. That is necessarily a political process, which is why the contempt for the political process, mindlessly expressed by many people, is potentially a mortal threat to our democracy. The successive surveys of the Hansard Society paint a picture of a society in which interest in public affairs is strong, but willingness to engage actively in politics has declined. The Conservative Party has been the dominant party of government for the past century. It obtained 43.6% of the vote at the last election, yet its membership has declined from about 2.8 million in the mid-1950s to about 180,000, according to the latest three-year-old figures. Labour Party membership is larger, at about 430,000, but still a long way below its earlier peak. This pattern is not peculiar to our country. It is fairly typical internationally. The membership rolls of established political parties has declined steeply in most European democracies. By comparison, support for new parties dedicated to the wholesale rejection of normal party politics has increased jerkily but noticeably. La République en Marche in France, the Five Star Movement in Italy, and Podemos in Spain have all presented themselves as representatives of a new electorate, spontaneous expressions of the popular will, as opposed to traditional political parties. Podemos has declared that there is no left and right, there is only the people, identified with Podemos itself, versus the caste, that is to say, the caste of professional politicians. In Italy, the Five Star Movement claims not to be a political party, but a movement, and has promoted direct democracy with electronic voting. Remarkably, lack of political experience was a central part of the successful candidate's pitch in the US presidential election of 2016, the French presidential election of 2017, and the Italian legislative elections of 2018. Now, these facts reflect a fundamental problem about democracy, which was first pointed out more than 2 millennia ago by Aristotle. Democratic representation creates a class of professional politicians. Aristotle regarded professional politicians as an evil. He thought that any political elite would end up by serving its own interests. And that has been the received opinion for centuries, from Aristotle to Noam Chomsky. In my experience, it is entirely untrue. Professional politicians can never be intellectually pure. They are constrained by the need to compromise in order to build majorities. But in general, they are public-spirited individuals with a genuine ambition to serve the interests of their country. Most of them would achieve a great deal more money and status by pursuing some other career. Nevertheless, the old trope that politicians are a bunch of corrupt, self-interested and power-crazed hypocrites is deeply embedded in the public mind and always has been. If you look at the graffiti in the ruins of Pompeii, you will find the same themes expressed there. Aristotle's solution was to abolish the political class and replace it by a system in which public offices would be held for short periods by men chosen by lot or serving in rotation. Everyone could then feel that they were at least potentially engaged in a system of self-government. This is hardly realistic in an electorate of 47 million or so, but Aristotle had nevertheless put his finger on the reason why very many people reject democracy. They feel alienated from the political class which democracies inevitably generate. There is no cure for this condition. Successful politicians are in the nature of things unlikely to be representative of the electorate. They require an altogether exceptional degree of ambition, application, and intellect. Those of them who are in government have to apply themselves to complex issues with an intensity for which most of us have neither time nor inclination. If one object of representative politics is to choose politicians who are best qualified to perform the exceptionally difficult job of governing, then our representatives will always be unrepresentative. None of this has stopped enthusiasts for constitutional innovation from exploring a wide variety of ways of sidelining the political class. Referenda are one possibility, but Britain's experience with referenda has not been entirely happy. They only work if people are voting about precise proposals, necessarily formulated by politicians, whose acceptance or rejection by the electorate will resolve the whole issue. Otherwise, they are simply the prelude to further rounds of political infighting, as we have seen. Citizens' assemblies are the current favourites. They are the modern equivalent of Aristotle's selection by lot. They seek to substitute for the political class a succession of focus groups chosen so as to be socially representative on the assumption that they will be politically representative of the categories to which they belong. That assumption seems likely to be wrong. Groups such as manual workers, members of particular ethnic groups, over 65s and so on, are no more uniform or consistent in their political opinions than the electorate at large. It's therefore largely a matter of accident whether our divisions are replicated in a citizens' assembly of, say, 100 people. But the fundamental problem about these assemblies is that they have not been chosen by the electorate, and they are not answerable to anybody. They have no democratic or other legitimacy. There are measures which might palliate the current problems of democracy, but without, I think, solving them. Foremost among these is proportional representation. Proportional representation would probably create a multiplicity of smaller political parties. That would more fairly reflect the diversity of opinion among the electorate than the current two-party system. It would also, partly for that reason, increase the degree of engagement in the political process. It isn't going to happen because it is contrary to the interests of the two major national parties, and there is no real demand for it among the electorate. The alternative vote referendum of 2011 suggests that the British prefer the crude simplicity of the first-past-the-post system to anything more elaborate. The other critical point, for present purposes, is that proportional representation would do nothing to address the alienation of the electorate from the political process. Indeed, it might well increase it, since it would lead to less stable governments and more political infighting. Now, I'm not about to suggest my own solution to that problem, because I don't believe that there is one. Whatever we may think of our politicians, it is an inescapable truth that we cannot have democracy without politics, or politics without politicians. We have to learn to accept the vices and virtues of professional politics because they are inherent in the whole nature of government. Getting rid of professional politics would simply lead to the replacement of the current political elite by a different one, which will be more permanent, more authoritarian, and less representative. Ultimately, all political systems are aristocracies of knowledge. Democracies are no different, except that the aristocrats of the moment are removable. That has a very significant effect on the way that they exercise power. A generation ago, the enemies of democracy were small groups of cranks and extremists of left or right. Today, democracy needs a coherent defense, not just against those who would like to dispense with it in favor of more authoritarian models, but against those who would like to redefine it out of existence. We have to say something to the 54% of our fellow citizens who would apparently prefer to be ruled by a British Putin. Why are they wrong? The simplest thing to be said in favor of democracy is that it is an efficient way of getting rid of unsatisfactory governments without violence. But there are, I think, at least three other, more positive and more profound reasons why people living in a country like ours ought to believe in democracy. In the first place, it is the best protection that we have for liberty. Since a large measure of individual autonomy is a necessary condition for human happiness and creativity, this is a consideration of some importance. I'm well aware of the oppressive possibilities of democracy. I do not doubt that it has an immense potential to oppress not just ethnic or social minorities, but political and moral minorities, people who simply believe in something that majorities object to. That was pointed out by Madison and Mill at the birth of modern democracy, and indeed by Aristotle 20 centuries or more before that. In most periods of history, the best guarantee of liberty has been the powerlessness and ignorance of the state. Historically, it was once relatively easy to escape the scrutiny of the state and to take shelter in the domain of private life. The immense power of the modern state and its almost unlimited access to information makes it much harder for us to hide. Access to the levers of power by democratic majorities is therefore potentially more dangerous today than it has ever been. But democracy at least offers the possibilities of redemption. Its values can be turned against those currently in power. By comparison, authoritarian states entrench themselves in power and institutionalize repression and cultural control in a way that is much more difficult to reverse. Secondly, among the reasons why we ought to believe in democracy, the creation of a political class, which Aristotle regarded as the great vice of democracy, may well be its chief merit. Political parties operate in what I have previously called the political market. They are coalitions of opinion, united by a loose consistency of outlook and the desire to win elections. To command a parliamentary majority, parties have traditionally had to bid for support from a highly diverse electorate. Their policy offerings mutate in response to changes in the public's sentiments, which seem likely to influence voting patterns. Their whole object is to produce a slate of policies which maybe only a minority would have chosen as their preferred option, but which the broadest possible range of people can live with. This has traditionally made them very powerful engines of national compromise and effective mediators between the state and the citizen body. It has also served as an excellent protection against extremes. Autocracy offers no protection at all against extremes. Thirdly, democracy is more efficient in implementing policy choices. There is a common delusion, which I suspect is shared by many of the 54%, that strong men get things done. They don't waste time in argument or debate. They get on with it. Historical experience ought to warn us that this idea is almost always wrong. The concentration of power in the hands of a small number of people and the absence of wider deliberation and scrutiny enables authoritarian governments to make major decisions on the hoof without proper forethought, without planning, research, or consultation. Within government, it promotes loyalty at the expense of wisdom, flattery at the expense of objective advice, and self-interest at the expense of the public interest. The want of criticism encourages self-confidence, and self-confidence banishes moderation and restraint. The opacity of autocratic government is a standing invitation to corruption. Now, these have always been the obvious advantages of representative democracy, and they're just as obvious today. But will they prevail? I am a natural optimist, but I have to say that I'm not optimistic about the future of democracy in this country or elsewhere in the West. All of the threats to democracy which I have been discussing in the past half hour seem likely to intensify in the coming years. The essential problem is that public attitudes, as I have been talking of them, are all too natural to human beings. Democracy has existed for barely 2 centuries in Europe and the United States, less in other places. It was the creation of an exceptional combination of political and cultural factors, which would never have been easy to sustain and whose impact is now fading. The craving for security is too deeply embedded in human nature to go away. 3 centuries ago, Thomas Hobbes made it the foundation of his case for absolute government, and it's certainly stronger in our day than it was in his. Fear will never lose its capacity to distort our collective judgments. The decline of political tolerance and the rise of moral absolutism are trends which are just as unlikely to be reversed. For tolerance, too, is not natural to mankind. Again, it was Hobbes who expressed it best. People, he observed, are inordinately fond of their own ideas, for they see their own thoughts from close quarters, but other men's at a distance. The major challenge to democracy in the coming years will, I suspect, be climate change. Climate change will be the main generator of collective fear in the decades to come, and quite possibly the main temptation to direct action. It is, of course, perfectly possible that we will do nothing much about climate change and simply chug along, dealing locally with the consequences as and when they arise. But I do not doubt that measures to deal with climate change are necessary. And on the assumption that some action is taken, it is likely to run into strong democratic headwinds. Most of the measures to deal with climate change involve curtailing economic growth. This will not be popular, and it may not be accepted by democratic electorates, especially if groups come forward to offer easier and perhaps specious alternatives. The main problem is that climate change can only be dealt with at an international level. That will require major decisions to be made internationally in a world where democracy is still national. It will be hard to square with traditional notions of democratic accountability. Democracy depends on a common sense of identity and a large measure of mutual solidarity. It depends on a feeling of common identity, a feeling that we are in it together in the traditional hackneyed phrase. Otherwise, people are unlikely to feel a common loyalty to a collective decision-making process, a common loyalty which is strong enough to transcend their disagreements about the actual issues. At the moment, this sense of solidarity exists, if at all, only at the level of the nation-state. We have had a stark reminder of that in the Brexit referendum. Perhaps in the future, climate change will generate a measure of international solidarity strong enough to legitimize action at international level. But I wouldn't count on it. National identities are becoming stronger, and climate change is likely to make them stronger still. That is because, although all humanity has a common interest in dealing with climate change, they do not have a common interest in the measures necessary to do it. We have seen this on issues like fossil fuels and deforestation. Countries like India, China, Malaysia, Brazil are not likely to accept measures which will restrict their ability to achieve a standard of living comparable to the West, especially when they reflect that historically the West has to some degree achieved that standard of living by polluting the world. Countries like the United States and Britain are not likely to accept a disproportionate reduction of their own standard of living as the price of international agreement. The logical outcome of the threat of climate change is not, therefore, international harmony in the face of a common peril. It is a world of competitive despotisms. The transition from democracy to autocracy is generally smooth and unnoticed. It is easy to sleepwalk into it. These things don't happen with a clap of thunder. Democracy is not formally abolished, but quietly redefined. It ceases to be a method of government and becomes instead a set of political values, like communism or human rights, which are said to represent the people's true wishes and interests without regard to anything that they may actually have chosen for themselves. Historically, the depressing fact is that the default position of human societies has always been some form of authoritarian government. The world is full of countries which have reverted to type. The democratic label is still on the bottle, but the substance has been poured out of it by governments, usually with substantial public support. Chile, Peru, Venezuela, Brazil, Mexico, Hungary, Egypt, Turkey, Russia, the list gets longer every year. Will Britain end up on that list? A generation ago, it would have seemed strange even to ask the question. But I hope to have persuaded you that today it is a real issue. Thank you for listening to me.
Jonathan, I know it's a popular misconception that the most important people and the most important judges are criminal ones. That's what the public tend to think, and obviously that's not the case. But I must say, I do feel slightly as if I'm in the dock before this person of tremendous wisdom. I don't feel this is going to be a conversation of equality, and I fear what sentence you may hand down upon me at any moment. But I think we know that the audience already here tonight has handed down whatever the opposite of a sentence is on you, and an accolade. I think it's been absolutely fascinating talk, and both of deep philosophical interest and also a great topical interest. Can I just raise a few things and ask you to say whatever you think? I'm very interested by, I think where you began actually, the opinion poll that people want a strong leader willing to break the rules. Now, is that actually evidence that they don't like democracy?
Not in itself, no. That's why I went on to talk about the Hansard Society surveys, because they demonstrate that a lot of people have an alternative vision of society which they prefer. Their complaints, or one of their complaints against the current system of government, is that they regard it as ineffective. Actually, it isn't ineffective, although it frequently fails to take action because there isn't a sufficient electoral or other consensus in support of that action. This is deeply frustrating for people who have strong opinions on whatever the issue is. And it seems to me that the suggestion that you would prefer a strong man, and in many cases you would prefer somebody who was at liberty to ignore Parliament, which is the only democratic institution that we have, that seems to me to be profoundly significant. I absolutely realize that opinion polls are fallible. They often reflect what people think, rightly or wrongly, will make an impact. But I think that the consistency of the polling evidence over quite a long period is telling and is depressing.
But mightn't something else be going on in the public mind about this, which is that there's a system, you've talked about this as well in your, there's a system and it sort of becomes sclerotic and it doesn't get things done, and And when they say they want a strong leader who breaks the rules, they're not saying we don't want democracy. They're saying one of the things democracy should do is shake things up. And one of the things leaders should do is behave rather differently from, let's say, senior civil servants or indeed judges. It's quite interesting that it's much more common for a leading politician to have a to lack a university degree even nowadays than it would be. In fact, it's not allowed in the civil service. You have to have at the top level a university degree, and I'm sure that's pretty much true of judges, isn't it? It must be.
In practice, I suppose.
Yes. And so in a way, people are sort of, when Michael Gove famously said, people are fed up with experts, I don't think he meant we don't want people who know things. He meant we don't want to be told what we're supposed to think by people who claim to know more than us, because democracy is not fundamentally an issue about how much you know. So there's an argument, I mean, he may have used the wrong phrase, but do you see what I'm saying? That people are actually employing democracy when they call for leaders of that sort, at least sometimes.
I think that to say people are employing democracy when they call for something that is the reverse of democracy is a paradox which I confess is beyond me.
No, well, yes. It's not the reverse of democracy, though. It's the reverse of democracy to be authoritarian. It's not the reverse of democracy to try to cut Gordian knots. That's why you elect people, actually. Otherwise, you would have a permanent bureaucracy.
Well, I absolutely agree with that.
So
I don't think I've said anything inconsistent with it.
Well, I would hate to accuse you of inconsistency, and you would, and I wouldn't.
Welcome to.
But I'm just slightly questioning your pessimism about this. I mean, similarly, you talked about referendums being so awful, and clearly they are highly disruptive, and it'd be very odd, unless you have a really Swiss system, that you would have a referendum on everything. But that's different because it's sort of institutionalized in Switzerland. But you don't want just to call a referendum here and there like a sort of massive opinion poll. But in the case of the Brexit referendum, there was a pretty big reason for it, which was that all the main parties had taken one view for 45 years, and increasingly the public didn't. And then they were offered the chance. Isn't that, goodness knows it causes trouble, but isn't that an interesting example of democracy in action?
Yes, it is, but there are reservations about that. First of all, my criticism of referenda is that the British experience, the recent British experience of them, has been that they have invite answers to questions that have at least 3 and arguably 6 or 10 different possible answers, but they're only offering 2. I mean, the Brexit referendum and the referendum on Scottish independence are classic examples of this. The Swiss system not only involves quite frequent referendums, it involves a system which is common to most European countries whose constitutions provide for referenda, under which you have to have a draft law. In other words, you have to have a law which is set out there, and with a yes answer will automatically bring that law into effect. Now, the Brexit referendum and the Scottish referendum were not like that. The alternative vote referendum was. The Act said, if the answer is yes, the following provisions will apply. And the same is true of other referenda across Europe. So this is not a system for sidelining politicians. It's a system for conducting an opinion poll about a project which politicians have devised. Now, you're absolutely right to say that the justification for the Brexit referendum was that the parties were at one in opposing projects to leave the EU. I think that if the referendum had not happened, that harmony would have disappeared. Because to my mind, the natural tendency of political parties to mutate in response to changes of public opinion, and I agree with you that public opinion has turned against the European Union over a period of at least 20 years and probably longer. This would eventually have caused the Conservative Party to become the anti-European party that it now is. It would have taken time, but not that much time. I think it would certainly have happened within 10 years. I think that would arguably have been a less disruptive process for our politics and our constitution than the process that we actually had, which involved a referendum which was necessarily inconclusive because the vital question, what our relationship with Europe would be if it wasn't membership, was not on the ballot paper and was therefore the subject of perfectly legitimate fighting among politicians for the 2 years which followed.
There always would be fighting, wouldn't there, on any big issue, almost regardless of how that is.
But it would come up before the referendum and not afterwards.
Do you think that, moving on, bearing in mind that result, is something else very interesting you were saying about the relationship between democracy and the nation state? And I think you were saying that there aren't really working examples of democracy except in the nation state.
Well, that is historically true. I wasn't saying that it is inevitable that is always going to be the case.
No. Yes. That was what I was going to ask, really. Do you think that, can you see any way that you could have democracy emerging as a sort of international constituency?
Well, yes, I think that is a possibility. It would depend on a very radical change of political mentality. And by the political mentality, I mean among the whole population, not just among the political class. I think that it is arguable, and I'm not putting it higher than that, that if we had remained in the European Union, a sense of European identity would have eventually developed. I think that it would eventually have developed as younger people who were notably more pro-European than their parents' generation became a majority. And I think that it would have become much more attractive as a result of the rapid increase in the population of the United Kingdom, more rapid than most other European countries, which would, according to the projections of the European Statistical Authority, have led to Britain being significantly the most populous state in the European Union by 2034, I think it was. Now, in that situation, the influence that we would have had, which was pretty considerable anyway, would have become at least as significant as Germany's influence now is. I think that would have altered mentalities. I'm not saying that I personally would necessarily have welcomed that, but I think that it is a possibility worth considering.
I mean, one of the things you talked about was that I think you used some phrase like cultural foundation that lies behind democracy. Can you actually imagine that cultural foundation truly cohering in an international democracy?
I think that it's much more difficult. The basic problem is that mutual respect for a decision-making process requires quite a powerful sense of identity. I mean, that in a sense was why the democratic deficit in the European Union, and I speak as a Remainer, was never filled by the European Parliament.
Yeah.
Because the European Parliament remained, in spite of the various rules governing the appointment of committees and the status of parties within the Parliament, it always remained a disparate collection of national agendas. But the basic problem was that nobody regarded the European Parliament as really speaking for them, except possibly in countries which have never really had a sense of national identity in the sense that Britain, France, or Germany do.
that's a very serious problem, isn't it? Because it's not just that the European Parliament isn't very well constructed. It's a fundamental problem about trying to be a country, country's not the right word, but you see what I mean, a union of 30 countries.
Yes. I mean, there's no doubt that my view about this is that it is theoretically possible. It might happen over a considerable period of time, but it's extremely difficult. Exactly the same points were made by many of the opponents of the US Constitution as it was being drafted in the 1780s. And there were indeed very significant cultural differences between the states. In Pennsylvania, that had a very large German population and a completely different historical background. Massachusetts, with its Protestant background and its early attraction to democracy, was equally different. I think that to many people it was almost inconceivable that these states, which had nothing in common except the English language, and even that wasn't common to everybody, would cohere into a single democracy. Yet it happened. One of the reasons why it's so depressing to see it unhappening at the moment.
Yes. Can I, by the way, I'm not sure this is my own view, but I'm just, for the sake of the argument, doing it. Can I challenge your pessimism that came through sometimes? I mean, you had excellent quotes from Tocqueville about, who obviously is a brilliant analyst, about the sort of mediocrity and the suppression of talent and originality and all the rest of it. But not long after he said this, America became the greatest country on earth, which it sort of remains. Isn't, in fact, it all a bit stronger than you would say? And you said towards the end that, you know, we didn't ask ourselves before, in relation to Britain, will British democracy survive? I think we did ask ourselves that in the 1970s. And in fact, the who governs Britain question of the February 1974 election was a sort of way of putting that. And there were a lot of doom-laden articles and books and so forth in which people said it can't go on because there's a crisis of authority, you know, the trade unions are going to take over, and so on. And democracy sort of overcame that problem in the end. There was an answer to who governs Britain.
Yes. I mean, looking at your American example, you're absolutely right. What de Tocqueville was doing, just as Madison had done 40 years earlier, was pointing to the natural tendencies of any democracy and observing what gave those tendencies force within the society that he was studying in the United States. I think that it is remarkable that democracies for a period of 200 years managed to resist tendencies which are natural to humanity and which many sages have pointed out had the propensity to destroy them. What enabled them to resist it was a very coherent common culture.
Yeah.
And that's why I suggested in my lecture that the problem is not that the institutions may fail, which was essentially the problem people were talking about in the 1970s. The problem is that the underpinning, the cultural underpinning which enables them to succeed is fading away.
Yes, that's very interesting. And when you said that, I wondered if I could develop that thought a bit with you, which is institutions. You were talking, when you said institutions just now, I think you meant the main political institutions. But yes. Is there a problem now, you touched on it about the lack of membership of political parties, where you have a strong state, perhaps an over-strong state, and a very great cultivation of personal autonomy in certain respects. But what you have definitely declined is independent institutions of all sorts of other kinds, such as political parties, or what happened, the amount of government influence, for example, on universities, here we are in one, compared with what it used to be, is much, much greater. And in a way, universities are spending their whole time arguing with the government, and the government arguing with them about what universities ought to be like, whereas once upon a time, universities decided what they were going to be like. Similarly, there's the national curriculum that Mrs. Thatcher introduced. She wanted it very narrow, but actually it started to cover everything pretty much, and so the government now tries to decide what happens in schools in a way that didn't used to happen. And you can see the collapse of voluntary institutions, how many people volunteer to work in charities or good works, how many people go to church, and so on and so on. That all those things, and local loyalties, and even the family actually, the family itself is not really, have declined as institutions, and that may be, I'm asking you, do you think, a real factor in the thing you're worried about?
Well, I think it is. I think that the dispersal, that the concentration of power, which has followed from the political downgrading, if I can call it that, but I'm talking about exactly what you were talking about a moment ago, the political downgrading of local government, of universities, of the professions, has very serious implications because it has added to the awesome power of the state, which in turn has meant that to obtain in a democracy control of the levers of power over the state gives you, puts you in a position to create a coercive society unless you are restrained by a very powerful culture which tells you that there are certain things that the state can do that you can get away with, which it would be wrong to attempt. We are losing that sense.
Tell me a bit more about judges in relation to this. I do recommend to everybody who hasn't read or listened to Johnson Sumption's Reith lectures to get onto them, because he speaks with remarkable frankness, actually, because judges have a great, and understandably so, have a great sort of solidarity with one another, but you do find in his lectures that he does actually criticize some of his former fellow judges, I mean very politely, but he does. And what he's talking about there, you didn't touch on it really much tonight, but it's relevant to what you're saying, is that judges have become too political, and have tried to arrogate to themselves things that are essentially issues for democracy. Could you apply that to what you're saying tonight about democracy? Because presumably that criticism of the judges is a very important one. I'd like you to develop it, but also there's perhaps a reason for the judges behaving this way is because they're worried about how democracy is being mishandled by politicians.
Well, I think there is an element of that. I mean, judges are acutely conscious of the political implications of what they do, and they are quite careful about the issues on which they choose to confront the executive. My concern about judicial intervention in political issues is that it cuts across, as I think you're suggesting, and I agree with it, it cuts across lines of accountability, which we need, because without the notion that a minister is responsible politically to Parliament, we are actually not a democracy at all. That is the only link that connects ministerial decisions with the views of the electorate at large. It's an indirect link, but it exists. But I think that a lot of people who criticize judicial intervention are calling it political when it isn't. There are many judicial interventions which are undoubtedly, to my mind, political. I mean, the classic example of this is the conduct over the last half century of the United States Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. The United States Supreme Court has taken it upon itself to extrapolate from very general provisions of the Constitution a whole raft of provisions which are essentially legislative. I mean, the most notorious example is Roe and Wade. I personally think that a right of abortion subject to suitable safeguards is absolutely essential to any civilized society in modern conditions. But I think that the decision to that effect to be taken judicially, in a way, therefore, that renders irrelevant the views of the American population, was a serious mistake. And it's one reason why abortion remains highly controversial in the United States, whereas it is almost uncontroversial in most countries of Europe, every one of which has adopted an abortion law, but by legislation.
Yeah. There's much to criticize, and you do so eloquently in the American system, but for sure, the Supreme Court in the United States embodies a diversity of opinion.
Less and less.
Well, it varies, of course, depending on how long one lodges in power, but it always has a mixture. And I emphasized the importance of diversity of opinion earlier in other contexts. I remember on the Today programme, when Lord Newberger was just about to cease to be the president of the Supreme Court, that the interviewer said there wasn't enough diversity in the Supreme Court. And
the interviewer was talking about ethnic and gender.
Exactly, no, I was just going to say that. And Lord Newberger said, yes, that's right, we need to change that, etc. And then the interviewer said, well, what about diversity of opinion? There doesn't seem to be any of that. And Lord Newberger said, no, we don't want that. Yes, he did.
Yeah,
and I was very struck by that, he did. And you've kindly revealed tonight, I don't know if for the first time, that you are a Remainer, and you were about our only hope in the whole bloody system, that there might be somebody who could vaguely understand what the 52% were talking about. It's fairly clear to me, though obviously I don't know, that all the members of the Supreme Court were Remainers.
No,
there was no diversity of opinion.
That is absolutely untrue.
Oh, good, well tell us, please, who were they?
No, I am not going to tell you. What I will tell you is this. I don't know the way that all my colleagues voted, but I do know the way that some of them voted, and I can assure you that there was a diversity of opinion. I'm not going to condescend to particulars.
One of the things that always comes up is...
I can also tell you, incidentally, that there was no correspondence between the dissent, whether you were a dissenter or a member of the majority in Miller number 1, had no relation to the way that they voted in the referendum.
Good to know, thank you. Thank you very much. Can I move to the subject of elites, which you, and how do you handle this one? Because I think you would agree, I think you may have said somewhere, not tonight, that apart from anything else, there, like them or not, there always is one. Mm. It's impossible not to have an elite in any country.
Somebody's got to be in power.
Yeah, and it's not just power it's not just the people who actually hold political office, it's people like you, it's professors, it's heads of business, it's chiefs of the armed forces and so on. That's just the way it's got to be. But there is a danger here, and perhaps it's fruitful to think of David Goodhart's famous distinction between people from somewhere and people from anywhere. Where do we go about that? We really are very fed up with them, and I'm not sure that people sufficiently understand that you do need them, but there is something wrong with them. How do you work your way through that?
Well, I think that what people dislike about elites is that they regard them as self-selecting and self-perpetuating. Yeah. They also, that's part of it. The other part is that they regard them as people who have lost touch with whatever populist roots they once had. I personally think that both of these complaints are factually wrong. But that is a very commonly expressed view. It's probably the view of a large majority of the British population. But the problem is that people become members of an elite even if they didn't start that way. This is in the nature of human organization.
So the revolt, there is more of a revolt against elites now than 30 years ago, isn't there? What's the reason for that? They haven't changed that much in their composition. In fact, they've probably become, in terms of background, they've probably become more...
They are more diverse than they were in, say, the 1950s or 60s, yes. Well, I think that, I sought to explain that to some extent in the course of my lecture. I think that people... it's partly a disengagement from politics. at a time, I think the high point of it was in the 1950s, when actual engagement in politics and not just a distant interest was a normal thing for families at pretty well every level of education or social attainment. At that time, I think that it was easier for people to accept the process which produced this elite, because they were themselves part of it. The more people distance themselves from the political process, the more likely they are to object to elites, even if they happened to vote for them.
Yes. We haven't got a great deal much longer, but I'd like to take up your very interesting point about the power of this spreading power of the state because of technology and surveillance and all that sort of thing.
It's not simply surveillance. I think
yes.
The main point is that the increased power of the state, for example, over the natural world, has vastly widened the range of things which the state can do. People are very reluctant to accept that there may be things that the state can do, maybe things that would be helpful in one respect, but which the state ought not to do because it would be unhelpful in some other respect.
What is the way through that? I mean, take, for example, medical records. Mm-hmm. Lots of people probably die, actually, but certainly their treatment is impeded by the fact that if they get ill in one place, the National Health Service can't necessarily get hold of the medical records. It's very tight. The records are held very tight for privacy reasons, mm-hmm. which are very understandable, but perhaps also fatal. And there are numerous examples like that where you can bring all this information together, and that's considered an advantage, but it's also a threat.
Yes, I mean, I think that there are some contexts in which the high value that we place on privacy is justified. And there are others, I suspect that they include the one that you've just mentioned, in which it is extremely unhelpful. I mean, I personally think that all decisions about privacy are a compromise between inconsistent views. We have a very absolutist view of privacy, which, as the law currently stands in this country, is largely the legacy of regulations passed at EU level, regulations which in many respects this country opposed and sought to water down. It succeeded in watering them down to quite a significant extent. But what remained has still been, in some ways, indiscriminate and therefore has unfortunate and unexpected side effects. You've just mentioned one of them.
Finally, very interesting that you picked on climate change as a sort of great challenge in all of this, about what people want now and what might matter later. COP26 right upon us. I think I took you to say that the aims, that it was a good thing to try and get, indeed an essential thing, otherwise it won't work, to get global agreement on these matters in order to. But is that in fact the right thing for politicians to do, to try to do, if actually it's impossible? I mean, is intentions, what's the good of good intentions if you actually sort of know when you think about it that this won't happen? And because isn't that the situation we're in? You know, when China is not going to do what Boris Johnson or Joe Biden, whatever, want it to do, for example?
Well, I agree with you that it's not going to happen, but nobody can be certain about that, and it's not a sufficient reason for not trying.
Really?
Yeah, really.
Well, thank you. That's marvellous. I won't do a formal vote of thanks because we are now going to hear from the Chancellor of Oxford.
I'm not going to summon the lectern because if there's a lectern, I'll go on too long. I want to be very brief. But first of all, I want to thank Charles Moore for surprising me so much just now. I'd never thought I'd live to the day when the editor of the Daily Telegraph, the former editor of the Daily Telegraph, would attack elites. I think that was That was one for the book. Can I first of all thank very sincerely the organisers of these lectures for arranging them and ensuring that we could have a broader argument and discussion in Oxford, because if universities aren't about freedom of speech, if universities don't understand that occasionally taking offence is one of the guarantees of liberty, then we don't understand very much. And I think that particularly important in this university, one of the jewels in our crown is the Voltaire Foundation, which is about to produce the last of 200 volumes of the works, the complete works, only scholarly edition of Voltaire. Hasn't been done in France, hasn't been done anywhere else, and I think it's quite important for us to reflect on that from time to time. So I want to thank you very much indeed for organising these lectures, and I'm delighted that we're going to have a reprise next year, though I hope they'll be as good and exciting intellectually as the one we've just heard. I just want to make 2 or 3 points. First of all, in his very interesting lecture, Tom Holland, the popular historian, as though he wasn't a good historian. I think he's just a historian who's widely read, but his popular historian is usually taken as a sort of thumbs down for somebody, which is very unfair. But in his lecture, he talked about the paradox in British history between conservatives and reactionaries, between cavaliers and roundheads. And I think one reason for celebrating Roger Scruton is that he managed to, that blurred line. Was he a conservative? I'm not sure. I'm said to be a conservative, and we're never on the same page. But he was certainly a man of considerable intellectual distinction and variety. And one of the things which I would want to particularly applaud was the brave, intellectually and personally, work that he did to bring together the academic communities in what were then the countries of Eastern and Central Europe living under communist tyranny, and academic communities in this country. I think it was extraordinary work, and I think will always be celebrated. My second favourite novel, after, of course, Middlemarch, is Lampedusa's The Leopard. If we want things to stay the same, they'll have to change. Prince Tancredi, the source of all wisdom as far as my political views are concerned. And I said I was on a different page to Roger Scruton. I think I once read a book about conservatism, actually. Been widely remaindered for about 45 years, and so widely remaindered that I couldn't even find a copy on my own bookshelves in order to remind myself what I'd said and thought. But I've always been profoundly suspicious of big, all-encompassing ideas. I've always been profoundly suspicious of the idea that there's a simple solution to all of life's problems. I was a great reader, insofar as one can always understand him, of Michael Oakeshott, who regarded life as a predicament, not a journey. And I think that's always been my view too. And it's why I've occasionally with enthusiasm wandered behind Roger Scruton's ideas, but not, to be honest, always. I'm also a great admirer in politics of ambivalence. I've never thought that enthusiasm was a particularly conservative virtue, but I do think that ambivalence is important, and it's a virtue which my hero, Rab Butler, practiced. He once said, without meaning it literally, when asked what the great lesson he'd learned about in politics, the most important lesson, he said that it's better to be generous than efficient. And I think it sums up the relationship between politics, economics, and morality. And I think it's partly the disjuncture between those things today which underlines some of the things that what Sumption was saying about the threats to democracy, and which, interestingly, are at present triggering a range of extraordinary reforms in China, thanks to an intellectual called Wang Huning, who wrote a very powerful book a few years ago called America Against America, which is now, I think, proving to be the touchstone for what President Xi Jinping is doing. But I just want to say finally how much I agreed, albeit reluctantly, with Lord Sumption's arguments this evening. I do think that democracy is challenged. And I do think it's challenged, among other things, by our reactions to climate change. Either by doing in our own countries what needs to be done in liberal democracies to deal with climate change, or by finding ourselves in a situation in which we're doing things, but many people in our societies are pointing to China or India or Russia, which aren't doing those things. And I think there's a second problem that we face, and that is the condition of the Republican Party in the United States. There was a remarkable essay by Robert Kagan, who's a very good right-wing commentator on international affairs the other day, in which he pointed out how the Republican Party was turning into simply the follower of a Trump cult, assaulting in so many ways some of the most important elements of democracy, like giving everybody who's a citizen in a country the right to vote. I agreed with what Jonathan said about the present state of the Supreme Court. And I certainly worry about the implications for all of us who live in liberal democracies and have to work together, not to contain China, but to constrain China in the next few years. If we find that we're not able to point ourselves to liberal democracies working effectively and implementing policies that are based on our belief in a set of values, the values of an open society. So with considerable reluctance, I share the thoughtful, intelligent, provocative pessimism that was laid out before us this evening. And I enjoyed the conversation afterwards as well, in which I think Charles didn't entirely go along with that. And of course, it's true that in the 1970s, we used to argue that Britain wasn't governable anymore, and it turned out to be governable thanks to a remarkable woman, not always given the credit that she deserved, for the fact that more than any politician in my political lifetime, she actually understood the science of climate change and global warming, having had a good chemistry degree at this university and having been educated by a well-known communist scientist. So I just want to say again how grateful I am to all those who've organized these lectures. I think they've been very important. They've reminded us from time to time of Simon Sharma's argument that history is an argument. And I think it's an argument which should attract those who believe in fair and reasonable and decent debate. I certainly think it should remind us, since this was organized by historians, that history is an admirably insurrectionary subject. And if it's not that, it's not worth studying. So thank you very much indeed for the lectures, and thank you for what you said this evening.